Joining us now for more on the latest in the global fight against ISIL. From Manila, Richard Heydarian is a geopolitical analyst and professor at de la Salle University. From Moscow, Dmitry Babich is a political analyst at Sputnik International. From London, Abdel Bari Atwan is editor-in-chief of al-Youm, Arabic independent newspaper. And with us in the studio, David Gartenstein-Ross is senior fellow with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Richard, let me start with you. We just saw that report there from our correspondent in the Philippines about the spread of ISIL in the Philippines. In your view, how much influence, how big is ISIL in the Philippines, and what is the government doing about it?
Well, personally, since 2015, I've been warning the Philippine government, particularly the previous administration, the Aquino administration, that it's just a matter of time before the ISIL will try to find refuge, just like Al-Qaeda in the 1990s, also here in the Philippines, because Mindanao region is a place of extreme grievance. You essentially have failed state institutions, and the borders are very porous with Indonesia and Malaysia, which are Muslim majority countries, and where you have significant amount of people who are sympathizers of the ISIL. In fact, the Malaysian police chief a year ago said there are up to 50,000 sympathizers of ISIL in Malaysia alone. So it was really just a matter of time. And we know that because of the coalition activities, because of the Russia-Iranian assistance to Syria, that hijra or migration to Syria and Iraq became increasingly difficult. So you had al-Adnani, the former spokesman of the ISIL, calling upon its sympathizers around the world, rather than going all the way there, to actually create their own distant caliphates or their own wilayats. So it was just a matter of time before they're coming here. Now, the thing is this: you already have a group of jihadist extremist groups which have already pledged their allegiance to the ISIL over the past few years. They came together and consolidated into a network in early 2016, and by middle of 2016, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi already recognized them as the representative of an emerging Dulat al-Islamiyya Wilayat al-Mashriq, or an Islamic State of the Orient. So we are already in stage 3. If there are 5 stages of grief, there are 5 stages of ISIL. You already are in the stage 3. What these ISIL groups lack at this point in time is actual territory and population. And Marawi was really ripe for the picking, because this is the largest Muslim majority city. There were significant support, perhaps, for the Maute group, which led these ISIL activities. They had preposition equipments in the area. They knew the geography of the area. They had tunnels. Everything was in place. So it was just a matter of time before they struck. And the thing is that the siege on Marawi came shortly after a failed raid for the 3rd time on Isnilon Hapilon, who's the designated emir of the ISIL here.
Right.
And importantly, when Duterte and much of his cabinet were also in Russia. So the timing was also very much fortuitous for the ISIL elements.
David, we see ISIL trying to spread around the world, but what is the status of the group in the Middle East itself, where it was actually born, in Syria and Iraq? We hear of all these victories, that they're suffering defeats. What does it mean?
Well, the group in Syria and Iraq is in steep decline. At this point, Mosul is all but cleared out, and you've already had coalition forces breach the old city of Raqqa, meaning that they're coming into ISIL's capital right now. The group has a mixed record. To me, I think it's helpful to look at this not just as an ISIL question, but as a question about the overall movement, the jihadist movement, which, unfortunately, regardless of the state of ISIL, the jihadist movement is right now in ascendance. In a lot of the places where ISIL has suffered steep setbacks, it often has done so at the hands of the old guard jihadists of al-Qaeda. So in Somalia, for example, where you had ISIL members cracked down upon ruthlessly, it was by al-Shabaab, which was the jihadist group that already had its feet there. Likewise in Afghanistan, where ISIL made a big splash in terms of its entry to the country. The Taliban helped to cut it down to size. Now, the last thing I'd say, when we look at this geographic region, when we look at Southeast Asia up to South Asia and the jihadist resurgence there, I look at it not so much as it popping up in Southeast Asia, but rather somewhat of a jihadist belt emerging in this area, with jihadism in ascendance in Afghanistan, with both the Taliban having a solid relationship with al-Qaeda, other groups in Pakistan, and then other issues where they've signaled that they have an interest of moving in are the Rohingya issue.
One thing, David, and that is, given the nature of this war, sometimes called the asymmetric war, a guerrilla war, terrorist war, Could there ever be a time when one could say, well, you know, the forces against ISIL have prevailed, victory is ours, it's all over?
Well, for ISIL specifically as an organization, I actually think the answer is yes, it's possible. They've had a terrible strategy. They antagonized everybody. If you look at their strategy in Iraq, Syria,
right.
They kept making enemies even of groups that weren't fighting them. That's what happened when they pushed into the Kurdistan region, for example. For jihadism, you know, right now you'd answer that no, but you also would have answered that no during the Cold War with all these various communist movements throughout the world. The fact is that movements change, and what's, you know, even in the world of militancy, if we were having this show, you know, 100+ years ago, we'd be talking about anarchist movements. So these movements do in fact end. I don't think we're good at fighting violent non-state actors, but that doesn't make them unstoppable.
So ideas at some point do end as well. Dmitry, what kind of danger does a group like ISIL pose to Russia? You know, Russia's involved in Syria right now. Does it pose a threat at all in Russia?
Well, not necessarily ISIL itself, but the jihadist movement in general, it does pose a threat. And here I would agree with what David just said. I think that the problem is the ideology. I mean, these groups may have different names like Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, Islamic State, but they all have the same ideology. They all strive for the same utopia. The utopia is to recreate the so-called Islamic Caliphate that existed in the 8th century and that spread all the way from Spain to the current Chinese border. That is, of course, a utopia, but the problem is that part of that caliphate occupied what is now a small part of the territory of the Russian Federation. And of course, a huge chunk of Central Asia was also a part of that Islamic caliphate. All of that puts Russia and the jihadists on a collision course. And I think in this situation, the Western world, of course, should be on the side of Russia. But this is the problem. Unfortunately, the Western world right now is so much under the influence of its own ideology, which I would call ultra-liberal or globalist. So the Western world is not prepared to ally itself to Russia, and even less so to the countries like Syria, with its imperfect but still a secular regime, in their fight against the jihadists. I think this is the main reason why these groups are so powerful, why they just don't want to be defeated militarily, and why they have been reborn even after they are defeated militarily. So I agree with David, until the ideology is alive, the movements will be alive. I think the comparison with the anarchist or die-hard communist Bolshevist movement, I think these comparisons are very right.
Right, okay. Abdel Bari Atwan, clearly there were conditions in Iraq, there were conditions in Syria that led to the emergence of a group like ISIL. Even if ISIL is defeated on the battlefield, those conditions will still exist, won't they?
Oh, yes, definitely. You know, ISIS will enter the history of the Middle East as the shortest-lived caliphate. We have to look at the forces fighting ISIS in order to understand the danger which this organization is posing, not to the Middle East, but for the whole world. About 60 countries, including superpower like Russia, United States, Britain, France, and regional superpower like Iran, Saudi Arabia. So we can see all these countries work together in order to defeat ISIS. This actually put it very clearly to us that this is a very dangerous organization. Yes, if ISIS is going to be defeated, and it will be defeated, no question about that, what about the incubators, actually, which gave ISIS the grounds to survive and to thrive in that part of the world? First, the ideology. The ideology of ISIS is actually Wahhabism, which is the most radical sect of Islam. And those people are convinced that they should actually conquer most of the Arab countries. I believe marginalization of certain parts of Iraq and Syria, and I'm talking about the Sunni one in particular, the suppression of Saddam Hussein people, they were marginalized again, they were actually thrown to the streets, humiliated, and also a lot of their families, a lot of their tribes. So this actually created the incubator for ISIS. If ISIS is going to be defeated, there are three things we should look at. First, are those people going to be treated differently and accommodated to the Iraqi society, Iraqi government, Iraqi political system? This is one thing. Second thing, are the unified front of those people the enemy of Islamic State, which they were gelled together because of their hatred toward the ISIS? Are this unity alliance will continue intact, for example, or is it going to be dismantled after the defeat of ISIS? And is ISIS going to actually exploit this division? The third, which is very important, do we have another ideology to counter ISIS ideology, for example, moderate Islam? Are we going to spread tolerance among the Muslim people in the Middle East? What about the foreign forces in Iraq and Syria? Are they going to stay or to pull out? What kind of regime we are going to have in Syria and Iraq after that? Is it going to be democratic? Is it going to be actually tolerant? Is it going to be, encouraging coexistence between all parts of that? That's the most important question we have to address.
Okay, we are going to take a break right now. Coming up, how can the international community stem the spread of ISIL? Our panel weighs in next. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.